Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping in the time machine, setting the dials for the mid-70s effects explosion, and we're zooming in on, well, a really curious and pretty ambitious pedal, the Electro Harmonix talking pedal. Yeah, our sources point to this coming out around, 1977, a time when EHX was really experimenting heavily with vocal effects format stuff. You're trying to crack that code, and that's really the hook for today. We want to figure out how EHX managed to get that talking guitar sound, those vowel sweeps, without the whole cumbersome setup. I mean, no plastic tube in your mouth like Frampton or Joe Walsh used. That classic talk box. Super expressive, sure, but also kind of messy, loud, feedback prone, just a whole thing. So the mission is, what was EHX's electronic shortcut? How'd they simulate human vowels purely inside a stomp box?
It's a fantastic example of EHX's mindset back then. They weren't just tweaking fuzz circuits. They were genuinely aiming for something almost biological, emulating the human voice electronically. The talking pedal was definitely part of that push, offering vocal sounds without, the physical hassle of the traditional talk box. And that purely electronic approach, that's what makes it so interesting historically, even if it wasn't, a chart topper in sales.
Okay, let's get into that electronic voice then. Because when guitarists hear treble pedal, the first thought is almost always wah. So the talking pedal wasn't a mechanical talk box, and you're saying it wasn't just a standard wah. What exactly was the difference in its design? What was under the hood?
Right, that's the crucial bit. If you look inside a typical wah, like a crybaby or something, you've got that variable inductor, right? That coil lets you sweep a peak frequency across a pretty wide range, maybe say 500 hertz up to 2K hertz, something like that, gives you that broad wacka-wacka sound. The talking pedal, though, completely different philosophy. It is a filter pedal, yes, but it's incredibly specialized. The tuning was, almost surgical. Instead of that wide wah sweep, EHX used fixed filter stages, and these were carefully, meticulously tuned to really emphasize the exact frequency clusters that make up vowel sounds, what linguists call vocal formants.
Oh, formants. Okay, maybe just quickly frame that for someone listening who's maybe heard the term but isn't quite sure. Why are formants the key to making something sound, vocal?
Sure thing. Think of formants as just peaks of energy in the sound spectrum. They're created by the shape of your vocal tract, your throat, and mouth. So when you change your mouth shape to say ah versus like e, those energy peaks shift around in frequency. For speech, it's mainly the first two formants, F1 and F2, that define most vowel sounds we recognize. So what EHX did with the talking pedal was engineer it to sweep through that F1 and F2 range electronically. When you rock the treadle back and forth, you're not just moving some generic filter peak up and down, you're actually shifting the electronic equivalent of your mouth shape, cycling between the frequencies that our brains hear as ah, e, ah, and so on. You're basically playing a synthesized mouth with your foot.
Wow, okay, that's a really clear distinction. It's not just a filter, it's like a phonetics-aware filter. But if they mapped out these formats, why did the original 77 version seem mostly limited to just those main vowel ow, ee, ow? And why did people often describe the sound as kind of nasal? Couldn't they get the full range?
Well, that's where you run into the limits of, 1970s solid-state tech in a small pedal. Trying to replicate the full complexity of human vowels, especially getting into the higher formats like F3 electronically, that was really tough and expensive for a stompbox format back then, so they had to make a compromise. They focused on the most prominent, the strongest peaks, F1 and F2, to get sounds that were recognizably vowel-like, even if they were a bit simplified. And that nasal quality you mentioned, that's probably down to the Q setting of the filters, the quality factor. See, a standard wah uses a relatively wide Q, makes the sweep feel smooth, broad. But to make those vowel sounds distinct and sharp, EHX likely needed a much higher Q setting. A higher Q narrows the bandwidth of the filter peak quite dramatically, and when you have a really sharp, narrow peak, especially in the mid-range frequencies, it often ends up sounding quite piercing, or, exactly as described, kind of electronic and nasal, very different from the warmer, maybe rawer sound of a tube talk box.
Got it. So EHX develops this clever tech, this focused filter, and they package it in that familiar big treadle chassis. Our sources mentioned it looked a lot like the EHX crying tone wah from the same time. Familiar outside, radical inside. Exactly
right. That classic, heavy EHX enclosure. Look like a wah, walk like a wah, but inside, totally different beast. And yeah, some of the early ones apparently had an added volume knob on the side, which kind of suggests that users probably found this sharp, High Q sound could really jump out, maybe too much. They needed a way to tame its level in the mix.
Okay, so we understand the tech now, how it makes that sound. Let's talk application. If it was cleaner, more electronic, maybe more nasal than a classic talk box, it probably didn't just replace the Frampton sound overnight. So where did this unique, maybe slightly choppy sound actually find its home? What kind of music used it?
It definitely carved out its own space pretty quickly, especially in rhythm and texture playing. Think late 70s funk, maybe some disco stuff. Because the sound was tighter, more precise, maybe less huge than a tube talk box, it worked really well for creating these choppy, percussive rhythm parts. Players who wanted a vocal-like texture that could sit right in the groove, cutting through without just washing everything else out. It gave that kind of driving staccato feel.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. That high Q nasal thing would cut right through a busy funk mix, wouldn't it?
Exactly. And beyond funk, you naturally saw it picked up by players in more psychedelic or experimental genres, people looking for sounds that were clearly not traditional guitar tones, sounds that screamed, "I'm being processed." It was a great texture generator. Oh, and you shouldn't forget keyboard and synth players either. They were always grabbing guitar pedals back then for weird filter sweeps and textures on their synths. The talking pedal would have been prime territory for that.
Let's place it in the EHX lineup back then. Because they were releasing so much stuff, especially filters. How did the talking pedal sit next to their other big filter pedals at the time?
It actually formed a neat little trio, you could say, a sort of filter family. You had the Crying Tone wah, that was their straightforward broad sweep standard wah, aimed at your classic rock blues players. Then there was the Dr. Q, that was their automatic filter, an envelope filter. It reacted to how hard you picked, giving you those auto wah quack sounds without needing a foot treadle. And the talking pedal slotted right in as the third option, the manually controlled vowel-specific filter. It gave you that hands-on, or rather foot-on control over the phonetic sweeps, which made it totally different from both the wide sweep Crying Tone and the automatic Dr. Q. It was the manual voice option.
It sounds like it was really innovative, but as we've kind of hinted, maybe not a runaway success. It feels like that very specific sound, maybe the complexity, made it a tougher sell to the average guitarist just looking for a basic wah. What happened to that original run? Did it just fade away?
Well, it was a combination of things. Its niche appeal, for sure, but also the bigger picture for EHX. They started hitting some serious financial headwinds in the late 70s, early 80s. So the talking pedal went out of production by the early 80s as the company was sort of heading towards bankruptcy. That period of crisis cut its initial run quite short, which of course is why the originals are relatively rare finds today.
And adding to the challenge for collectors, because it used that same Crying Tone chassis, there's always that potential confusion. Is it a real talking pedal or just a more common wah in the same box?
Oh, absolutely. You really have to look for the specific talking pedal branding on the enclosure. Sometimes you might even need to check the circuit board inside to be sure it has that special formant-tuned filter. But yeah, the short production life means it wasn't really a failure because it sounded bad or anything. It was more like a commercially limited experiment that got caught up in wider company problems.
Okay, so the original kind of fizzled out relatively quickly. But then, jump forward like 3 decades to the 2010s, EHX digs the name back up and releases the modern nano talking pedal. Given that the original was maybe a niche product that didn't last, what prompted them to revisit it? Why take that risk again?
I think the whole context had shifted massively by the 2010s. For one, pedal boards were getting smaller, hence the nano format. But also, the appetite for unique, vintage-inspired, slightly weird textures was huge. Boutique pedals were exploring all sorts of strange filters. EHX probably looked back and realized, hey, we actually own the IP for one of the original electronic vocal pedals. It was sitting right there in their history. And the reissue came with a really key upgrade. They ditched the old-school mechanical pot under the treadle. Instead, they use their modern, no-moving parts optical sensor design, just like they did with the Crying Tone reissue, actually. That made it way more reliable, quieter, less prone to wear and tear. A big improvement. But the crucial thing is, even with the tech update, the core sonic idea was the same. That focus sweep through the vowel formants. And the fact that the modern version is done pretty well, I think it kind of validates the original 1977 concept. It suggests the sound itself was maybe just a bit ahead of its time, waiting for the right market conditions and more reliable tech to really find its audience.
Right, that brings us nicely to the wrap-up, the big picture view. Why does this specific kind of niche pedal hold such an interesting place for gear historians and enthusiasts? If you had to boil it down, what are maybe the top 2 or 3 reasons the talking pedal really matters in the EHX story?
Okay, well, first, as we've said, it was a real pioneer. Simple as that. It was genuinely one of the very first dedicated, mass-produced vocal formant pedals guitarists could just buy and put on their board. It really laid some early groundwork for the whole trend of electronic talking wahs and specialized filters that we see so much more of today, especially from boutique builders. Second, I think it perfectly shows EHX's experimental spirit back then. Their willingness to push way beyond just making another fuzz or phaser. That drive to emulate the human voice electronically forced them to develop more complex filter designs, multi-stage stuff, specifically aimed at funk, texture, weirdness. It really expanded the idea of what a guitar pedal could do.
And the third point, the one that maybe connects most directly to the pedals people are still using today, the filter family legacy.
Exactly. While the Dr. Q was technically their first envelope filter, the research and the complex filtering architecture they had to figure out for the talking pedal, that work directly fed into the evolution of what became arguably their most famous and successful filter line, the Qtron family. The Qtron, with all its sophisticated filter options and formant-like sounds, owes a significant debt to those early experiments. Experiments done with the crying tone, sure, but maybe even more crucially, with the very targeted, specialized vocal filtering of the original talking pedal. It was like a necessary stepping stone.
That really ties it all together. We've gone from that clunky tube and hose talk box right through to EHX's early, clever electronic solution for vowel sounds. It's a great story of, like you said, ambition, maybe some technical compromise given the era, but eventual validation decades down the line.
It really does make you think, doesn't it? Here you have the talking pedal, a niche effect, short production run, hampered by external factors. Yet the core technology, that idea of electronically simulating vocal formants, clearly influenced later designs like the Qtron, which became a massive success, a staple effect for many players. So it leaves you with a question, really, a thought for you, the listener. How many other commercially limited, maybe even failed experiments in music gear history have actually had a huge, maybe disproportionate influence on the standard tools we all use today? What other early EHX innovations strike you as maybe hidden stepping stones to the gear on modern pedal boards?